Okay, there you are.
Hi, perfect.
Okay. All right, so everybody's good, everybody's here. George, Pamela, Tandazani, thank you everybody for joining us. Sound is okay, I guess you just go like that.
I'm okay.
So if we can ask the non-participants to be on mute, that would be very helpful, just so we don't have any sound, interference. So thank you for joining us today. I am currently sitting at El Espacio 23 in Alapata in Miami in our new exhibition entitled Witness, Afro Perspectives from the George Perez Collection. I'm joined by George Perez, collector and philanthropist from Miami, Pamela, Phatsimo Suntrum, artist included in the exhibition, and our guest curator, Tandazani, Dhlakama, from assistant curator from Phatsimo. So welcome everybody. So a few housekeeping things before we get going. I just wanted to read a brief bio on two of our participants and then we can jump right into the conversation. If any of you guys have any questions along the way, please feel free to write them in the chat and we can address them at the end of the conversation. My colleague Annelies is on the other side of El Espacio in front of another piece by Pamela, and she will also be sharing her screen with some reference images and some installation shots of the exhibition. We are hoping we can get together in person soon, but in the meantime, this will have to do. And I just want to let everybody know that El Espacio is open to the public by appointment. So we are receiving visitors, taking every precaution and very safely. So we encourage people to visit us and make appointments online via our website, elespacio23.com. So before we begin, I just want to, I'm sure many of you know Tandazani. She's originally from Zimbabwe, but she's the assistant curator at Phatsimo in Cape Town. And prior to joining Phatsimo, she worked at the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, where she held various roles between 2011 and 2017. In 2017, she was the conference coordinator for the second International Conference on African Cultures, which took place in Zimbabwe. She's curated numerous exhibitions and has been published extensively. She holds a master's in art gallery and museum studies from the University of Leeds in the UK, and a Bachelor of Fine Art and Political Science from St. Lawrence University. So thank you, Tandazani. It's been a pleasure working with you despite all the difficulties over the past few months, but we managed to put together an extensive exhibition via Zoom and WhatsApp and FaceTime and everything. So it's been quite an accomplishment. So thank you. It's been a pleasure working with you. Pamela, I'm going to just read a short bio. She's obviously exhibited extensively internationally, but she was born in Botswana. And her multidisciplinary practice encompasses drawing, painting, installation, and animation. Her work alludes to mythology, geology, and theories on the nature of the universe. Sunstrum's drawings take the form of narrative landscapes that appear simultaneously futuristic and ancient, shifting between representational and fantastical depictions of volcanic, subterranean, cosmological, and precipitous landscapes. One of her most notable projects was in London, came from the 2018 mural which wrapped around the exterior of the showroom. The work was dedicated to South African novelist Bessie Head and formed part of the exhibition entitled Women on Airplanes, curated by the Autolith Group. We're happy to have several of Pamela's pieces in the collection, 3 of which are included in this current exhibition. So without further ado, I think we should just hop into the conversation. So thanks again for joining us. I think, George, you're going to be the first one in the hot seat. So we wanted to, I think the biggest question, and we've been receiving in the space, is how does a curator, a collector from Miami, Latin American, based in Miami, most notable for having a collection of Latin American art, where did your focus shift into having an interest in contemporary African art? And why?
Yes, Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us. And thanks for the incredible exhibition that was put together by everybody. And Pamela, you've become, I told in another interview when they asked me, who's your favorite uh, young artist? You were mentioned for better or for worse. So um, I really, really, really love your work. Um, I I came here by almost by accident. I really had never been to Africa, except Northern Africa, Egypt and Morocco. Never been to the Southern African part of the African continent. Um, and I traveled in it with family. Mostly, really, they had told me Cape Town was a beautiful city, and then to go on a safari and to go to the wine country. As we always like South African wines. And while I was in Cape Town, a friend of mine said, "You want to go and see some of the galleries?" And I said, "Yeah, that'd be great. I don't know anything about." Um, African contemporary African art, um, except guys like Elana Tsui and Kentrich, the better known artists. And so I went there, and I remember going to Momo and Goodman and Stevenson and Smack, and all these galleries, and I was blown away. I really sort of was love at first sight. I said, this is unbelievable, and I started seeing some of the similarities with me growing up in South America. Being a product of these colonial societies that either decimated or enslaved, native populations, and had a lot of the problems with prejudice and capitalism and sexism and all those issues. And in Africa, I just saw sort of a different way of looking at similar historical events. And I really started spend I was only going to spend a couple of day in Cape Town, and I ended up spending 3 days just looking at galleries and exhibitions. The Zeitz at that time was under construction by a friend of mine, that was doing the interiors of the museum. So it wasn't ready, um, and I fell in love. And since then, I started, collecting. Became friends with all these gallerists and met some of the artists. Went to Kentrich's. Met Kentrich and met a lot of the young artists. Coming out of South Africa, and South Africa was sort of like the center for the rest of Zimbabwe, and so a lot of the artists were exhibiting in South Africa. And from then on, I've taken probably 6 trips to South Africa, and have been increasing the collection. Became also good friends of the two auction houses that we follow, which is Aspire and Strauss, and just really, really became immersed in this incredible new forms of expression coming out of Africa, and that's how I started, and now it's become, as Patty knows, an obsession. I think I probably spend half my time learning about contemporary African art.
Thank you, George. And I think it's notable to mention that at the same time that we are inaugurating Witness here at El Espacio, the Perez Art Museum in Miami is also opening Allied with Power, which is African and African diaspora artists from your collection as well, a promised gift to the museum. And so how do you feel about Miami being part of this conversation right now in the moment that we're living in exhibiting these works both at the public institution and at El Espacio 23?
No, I think there's two answers to this. One is for the United States. We came at a time. Actually, we planned this way before the riots and Black Lives Matter. but it coincided with a very, very important sort of a point of inflection in the race, issues of the United States. And I think both exhibits have gotten extra importance because of the what's happened over the last year, with police brutality and prejudice and so forth. The other thing, Patricia, that is very important for me in Miami, is that we become a center of people of different races. Miami is a melting pot, between between the South and the North, and and it's very important for me for Miami to be the host of these great exhibits. Additionally, the second part that I was getting into is I really got very much as I studied this, when the Europeans invade Africa and the slave trade starts. The three main points in the Americas that were the receptors that received the slave trade were the United States, Brazil, and Cuba. And I became very interested in the connections between that African diaspora. How do the artists, from how do the movements in Africa affect people of color that went to these three places? And you see in our collection, great similarities, and channels of collecting, people of color of African descent that are, Brazilian African, Cuban African, and American African, and U.S. African. So, this connection is very, very important, and I'm glad that we are in both the exhibits are um, emphasizing that connection.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that Miami is obviously a majority minority city, obviously with an influx of Latin American and Caribbean populations from many different countries. And I think it's been incredibly interesting for us as curators and for you as a collector to work with Tandazani, because we, living in Miami, have a certain view. So we've had really great conversations with Tandazani about kind of, from the outside looking in, vice versa. So I wanted to talk to Tandazani about her experience, obviously working in an institution at Phatsimo. How was your experience working with a private collection where essentially the work has somewhat been pre-selected based on the collecting process in itself, right? So, we want to hear about how your experience was working, creating this exhibition from a private collection.
Thanks, Patricia. Before I answer that, I just want to say thank you to the amazing El Spazio 23 team. You guys were just such a blessing to work with. And also thank you to George for this invitation. To answer your question, I think I was fortunate to be able to work with such a rich and diverse collection. So it made it a lot easier to be able to pick out important narratives and to think about this moment that we're in as humanity. It was such a treat to be able to access, when I talk about the range, I mean, I'm talking about even from some of the great modern artists from the continent, like the George Pembers, Robert Hodgins, Ibo Diop, to younger artists like Maurice Mubikai and Makita Ahuja. So, and it wasn't just, it was very broad in terms of being able to call it African perspectives, because we were able to really, the work, I was able to select work from, I mean, every geopolitical space on the actual physical continent is represented. So it was really a treat, and to figure out how can we position like older artists with younger artists to show a historical continuum, or to talk about important narratives or cycles that keep repeating themselves. So this made my work really interesting and exciting. And I didn't feel limited in any way. But at the same time, I also was careful to not create an obvious chronological reading. So you will see, I'll just give an example, like, trying to think of an example. Like you'll see Tanya Peterson next to a much older artist, but within the same thematics. And I just wanted to find ways of complicating this chronology or making the colonial disruption the center of everything, because there's so many other narratives that emanate from that. Yeah, and it was also really, it was a great treat for me to be able to show artists who are maybe lesser known in the US. So there are artists where I'm sure a lot of people would recognize some of the names, but there are other artists who've been practicing for years who are really important, who I'm really happy that they can get a platform within the Miami art scene.
Absolutely, I think that's really interesting a lot. I always, when visitors come, they say, you know, we don't know, we know maybe a handful of names of artists in the exhibition. So that's also part of what our mission is to create awareness of all these other artists that are working, you know, in the same scene. Can you tell us, let's talk a little bit about the title of the show, Witness, obviously very timely and relevant. Can you tell us how, you know, conceptually it's a rather large space, and, you know, the way that we work together to divide the show into seven different sections, Pamela's work obviously being present in 2 of them, but maybe let's talk a little bit about the structure of the show and the themes that it encompasses.
Well, I think George kind of alluded to it a little bit, but this year has been really interesting. It's been an interesting time with so many art institutions having to close momentarily, and unfortunately some for good. A lot of people in the art industry have been asking, what is the role of art? What is the role of cultural institutions? What is the role of artists? And I've been thinking about that a lot, of course, as a curator. And one of the many answers is that artists are witnesses. You know, they're witnesses for the moment that we're in, and they're witnesses that help us to remember our identity and our history. And they bear testament to the time. At the same time, in different parts of the world, in many different ways, the global pandemic has has put a magnifying glass on a lot of social injustices. And we've seen like a heightened cry for change and for justice. And a lot of people have gone into like an existential crisis because of that. So a lot of inner questioning, a lot of questioning on society and structures. Obviously, there have been heightened conversations about race, about different types of politics, about gender. And so I'll give you an example with some of the things that happened this year. So you find yourself witnessing a video that someone else was witness to or took. And that video shows a man in his last 9 minutes before he dies. So who's implicated in that? You ask yourself, you know, and yes, this is a specific moment. It was 9 minutes, but you find that the narrative is linked to so many other systemic issues, to so many other historical issues, to memory, to lived experience. You start asking questions around your own privilege, not necessarily white privilege, but even here in South Africa, I remember when our lockdown happened, I remember I bought 21 days worth of groceries, and I felt extremely sad because it hit me that I'm so privileged that I could do that. What about people who are in one room in a shack or whatever? So there were just, you know, these types of questions. So that's how the concept kind of came about, because we it's been a time of questioning, it's been a time of introspection. And it was interesting. What I loved about the collection was that I could bring together African perspectives and African in the broader sense. And I mean, I don't know if you want me to elaborate a little bit more on the themes.
Just let's
And how
just
we
kind
wrote
of,
those.
yeah, I think that would be interesting, because then we're going to talk about Pamela's work within those, so that could be interesting.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, the idea of witnessing, I also wanted to complicate the so-called African perspective, because it's not one perspective. It's complicated, it's contradictory, it's surprising. So the first section, so one of the section is, we've titled it Things Fall Apart, after Chinua Achebe's really well-known book. And that section talks to colonization, slavery, you know, the contact zone, the place where cultures clash and there's a major disruption. And there you'll find artists like William Kentridge, Leonce Agbajelo, Yinka Shonibare, Pamela is obviously in that section. Then you move into a section called Longing and Belonging, which talks to cartography, migration, the absurdity of borders, displacement, and you have artists like Nobuko Taba, Alexandra Maxwell, Gerard Max. Then there's a section called Nervous Conditions, and the Nervous Conditions is the title of a famous book by Tsitsilanga Rembwe, a Zimbabwean writer. And that book basically narrates a country, well, Zimbabwe's transition from being a colonial state to an independent state. And it basically talks about the messiness of the post-colonial moment, the contradictions, the disillusionment, there you'll find artists like David Goldblatt, Kudzanai Churai, Kendall Gears. Then there's a section called Post. And in this section, I was thinking about how we sometimes pigeonhole artistic practice. So, and a lot of the artists in this section actually, you can't necessarily pin them down. So they're talking about the irony of being in a post-independent state, whether it's a state of mind or a physical state like a nation, talking about postmodernism, the complexities of the post-colonial resistance, intergenerational trauma. So for example, you'll find the work of Sue Williamson, This Particular Morning, where it's a mother and her son in talking about the day that his father was bombed during apartheid, and the son kind of finding out all these things that he didn't know from before. Then there's a section which is very contemplative, which is the section on spirituality. And in this section, it's like, what do you do when you have all this intergenerational trauma or rage, or you know, you live in a world of contradictions, and you know, you end up looking for solutions elsewhere, or trying to trace your ancestry, or like with an artist like Tracy Rose, you actually create, the work becomes like an act of transgression. It's a form of conjuring, so to say. And there you'll find artists like Carlos Martial, Mishek Masamvu, Jose Bedia. And then in the mezzanine floor, we think about this origin. So what happens when you can't really, when you're basically hoping for a better world, or wanting to point to something greater than you, you create your own utopia. You think about, you know, a lot of people when they talk about pre-colonial times, it's usually a very romanticized view. So you have artists like Ati Pataruba, you have artists like Tanya Peterson, who's tracing her own genealogy through performance. And then the last section, when we were installing, we kept calling it the self-determination wall. And it's basically the section where we wanted to resist, or you know, the stereotypical view of Africa. So you'll see there's a lot of photographs and paintings as well of people laughing and dancing, relaxing, just trying to resist this stereotypical view of, you know, portrait of the African suffering, the African going through trauma. And so you'll find works by Malik Sidibe, J.D. Ojekere, David Kolowane, George Pemba. So the whole aim was to try and show multiple perspectives to this idea of witnessing, and witnessing from different vantage points.
Thanks for the summary. So now that we've gone into, you know, we've gone a little bit over the different sections, I wanted Pamela to talk a little bit about, you know, the inclusion of her work in this exhibition and how she sees her work within the context that we've placed them in the different sections. I guess since I'm here in spirituality and I have Destroyer behind me, you want to start talking about this piece?
Sure, yeah. And yeah, I'd like to also add my thanks to everyone for this invitation, and thank you, George, for the shout out. It really did mean a lot to me. And I'm really proud to have my work in this show amongst such a dazzling, kind of spectacular cast of my peers and my heroes. So it's really quite an honor for me. I was thinking, George, as you were talking in your introduction of how you kind of found yourself looking at contemporary African art, and just hearing you speak a little bit about your own background culturally, I was remembering how in my early studies when I was in university, and even just before I went to university, the impact of Latin America, the Latin American African diaspora, and how that my experience with people and the places there had on really shaping my own political identity. That because of my upbringing and the kind of distance that I always had, physical distance that I always had growing up as an African outside of Africa, I found myself really identifying with theories and writing and art of the African diaspora at large, and particularly amongst those makers and writers and thinkers in Latin America. And I remember joking really recently, actually, with a friend, thinking about, I had gone to this really strange sort of a high school, like an extra 2 years after high school in New Mexico in the United States. And it was a really international school that pulled students from all over the world. And so as a result, once students arrived at this school, they would kind of group off into their kind of amongst their continental comrades. And it was the Latinos and the Latinas who I found to be the most woke politically, and that I learned so much about radicalism, about independence, about struggle through these young students that I was able to kind of learn and grow alongside of. And when I went to university, I didn't directly study art. I kind of did a bit of a circuitous route around several different fields of interest. And one of the kind of largest focuses of my study, at least in undergrad, was international studies, focusing primarily on what was at the time called transnational cultures. And I was able to sort of shape my studies around this, looking at the African diaspora from a Latin perspective and a global perspective, as a way of trying to locate and find language for my own experience as an African woman. And it was in this kind of language of the African diaspora that I started to see myself a little bit better, to see myself as as African, and as a contemporary African, and still have kind of a not only an ancestral claim and a cultural claim, but a political claim to a place, even though it was a place that I could only have short time living in or being in. And I think that's an idea that's in my work, this idea of kind of being at a periphery and longing for a center, longing for a specific location that I would say is really at the heart of all of the pictures that I make, all of the images that I make, and how that longing creates a tension that is, really quite internal, but then also manifests globally in these, periods of strife, political, violent, and in this moment, medical, all caused by the kind of tension of boundary, of closeness, proximity, and far awayness. So I guess the piece behind you, Patricia, is called Destroyer. And yeah, it was a work that I made after I'd made a previous work also called Destroyer. So that one is Destroyer 2. Destroyer 1 was a much less of an interior view. It was kind of a safe over-the-shoulder view of a similarly garbed character. And this one, I wanted it to be much more frontal, much more confrontational, to sort of face this figure that's sort of writhing, whether it's in ecstasy or in pain, in tragedy or in triumph. I've been thinking a lot about heroes, or what it means to be heroic, and how sometimes being heroic means participating in or choosing to behave in ways that are very unheroic, very anti-heroic. And so a lot of the figures in the works that are in this show are a little bit complicated. And this sort of a gown that is made of feathers and made of birds and maybe made of corpses of birds, and the figure that's wearing them, I wanted there to be a little bit of a question as to whether the figure is wearing this garment or is being overcome by the garment. Is the garment wearing the figure in a sort of a spiritual sense? There were, I think, the connection between the figure in this work and, say, the figure behind Annalise, the big sort of family that I think of as a bit of a family portrait called The Seven. I think of all of these women as different iterations of either myself or of family members that I know, or family members that I've invented, or selves that I've invented. And so whereas these 7 sisters here are really quite held together, well put together and arranged, and really quite precise in the way that they're presenting themselves to the viewer, there's a real contrast there between these figures and the figure in Destroyer, which is much more explosive and vulnerable and sort of maybe dangerous as well.
I guess that leads me to another question or comment, and also for Tandazani, when we going over the artists that we were including in the exhibition, we talked about the inclusion of women artists and the female voice, and as throughout the installation, we noticed obviously the number of women in the exhibition, but also the number of images that include the female body or the form. I could just, next to me is Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, and in front of me is Belgi Sayon. You are here, Mary Sibande in the next room, Lola Amira. So there's a number of artists where we're seeing the presence of the female form. So I wanted to ask you guys, or Tandazani and Pamela, to comment on that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was, in my practice in general, it's very important to make sure that more women artists are made visible because of the obvious reason that historically women artists have been underrepresented or ignored, or when they are included, it's usually, well, not so much anymore, but it's kind of tokenistic. So I really didn't want that with this show, and I wanted them to be visible. And I mean, not necessarily talking about numbers. If you asked a question about the body, it was important to include artists who, some of the artists, like if you look at Bernie Searle, Tracy Rose, Kanyisile Mbongwa / Lola Mira, and a few others, Nobuko Ngaba, they insert themselves in the work. They use the body is central to their work. And I think for some, not all, but for some of the women artists in the show, it's because the female body has been a site of protest, has been a site where others have projected certain agendas. So I like the fact that it's a way of taking back agency and doing so in a way that speaks to really important, pertinent issues today. And I loved how, even just thinking about the body and the women artists, I loved the intergenerational conversation that we've begun to see in the exhibition, from like someone like Bernie Searle to Nobuko Ndraba, who graduated from university a few years ago. Yeah, but even Tanya Peterson in a way as well. Yeah.
And also, I had a question for Pamela and, you know, for other artists in the exhibition. I noticed that there's a common practice to create this alter ego, right? Or this other self. We see it with your work, Pamela, and, you know, we see it with Mary Sibande, who creates an alter ego, and you mentioned Lola Mira. So there's, and it's, I find it interesting that in this one show, we see this, you know, happening several times. So I wanted to address that because I think it's particularly interesting, you know, this creation of this alternate person view.
Yeah, well, for me, I think I really resonated with the way Tandazani described it, that our bodies as women and as artists, maybe as humans, but certainly as women, are become these sites, you know, whether we are complicit in that or not. And for me, in my work, I began asking myself, like, what is it that I want to put on the line? You know, how important is my story? How important is this work? And what am I willing to put on the line? And for me, I was thinking about narrative, I was thinking about history, I was thinking about ancestry, and to carry all of that on my one little body felt insufficient. So I needed more than just my one self. I needed this alter ego to sort of carry the magnitude of this story, and also to give me a break a little, to sort of have a back door to protect myself and say that this is my body that I've used as this image, but it's not just my body, it's another body, or it's any body, and it's the one that I have the right to use because it's mine. It has its own failsafe to kind of hide behind it, that, oh no, that's not me, it's just this alter ego that I use to kind of carry this difficult work on my behalf. So it's a sort of a protection, a strategy for protection, and still a way of kind of using an authentic voice, of being sort of the least exploitative, I guess, in whose voice you use to tell your story.
If I could just expand on that, I love what you say, Pamela. And I would like to also point to other artists who are working in a similar way, but also not only an alter ego for themselves, but it also becomes a vehicle to talk about their genealogy, their ancestry, like immediate ancestors, but also other women. So if you look at Zinzeni Marasela, who's also in the exhibition, she embodies, or I don't know if she would say she embodies or she performs Theodora. And Theodora is a South African woman who her husband went to find work in Johannesburg, probably in a mine, and so she gets tired of waiting for him to come home. So she goes to this big city, Johannesburg, and looks for him. So you'll see in a lot of her work, Theodora's looking for Gebane, the husband. So she becomes this fictional figure who actually is she's an entire generation of Black South African women who've been waiting. But she's also her mother, because some of her earlier works, she was literally trying to kind of have a breakthrough or understand her mother and why she couldn't articulate her traumas. Same thing with Mary Sibande and the domestic worker garb that she wears. It's like thinking about her mother, but then thinking about her grandmother and all the other women in her family and the absence of her father, but she gets to know her father through all these other women. So it's interesting that the body also becomes a vehicle to talk about multiple, multi-generational histories.
Yeah, and on that point, I guess maybe we can bring into the conversation someone like Eniwaje Oluwaseyi from Nigeria. The image of it's also a female form, but I think that takes on a different role. The one in the mezzanine origins, where it's kind of just the everyday, life of a female, of a woman. So, I think that contrast that we see throughout the exhibition is particularly interesting to me as well.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to, I mean, I may be wrong, but if you look around at what's happening now, and we'll probably be able to understand it retrospectively, but I think there's a resurgence in figuration, in Black figuration, and I think it's kind of a response to what's been happening, heightened debates around race and agency and power and hierarchies. And so what better way to talk about ourselves by finding new ways of depicting ourselves?
And I guess, George, let's bring you in as a collector here, now that you mentioned that there is, this trend, if I could say, of figuration, and especially the Black figure. George, how do you, as a collector, maybe some people come to see this show and expect to see the names that we've been seeing, in the market, right? And I think maybe, George, it would be interesting to have your perspective as how you kind of weave in and out of the market as a collector. But I think that it's interesting, your collecting process, how you react to the work and are not necessarily so driven by what is so trendy at the moment.
Yeah, Patricia, the fights that I've had through the history of loving some figurative works, in which at the beginning people would say that's too commercial or that's not valuable, and then all of a sudden these pieces have gained tremendous both critical value and financial, and economic value. I hope I don't follow trends. I think figurativism, particularly coming out of Africa, is exceptional, and it was exceptional years back. I feel very much at ease in different forms of expression, whether they're abstract, whether they're figurative, whether they're conceptual. They all have a message to me, right? I mean, I think it's all a way an artist is expressing or witnessing, as the exhibit is called, something, whether it's their past, the country's past, an ills of society, a dream. And all these things have always been interesting to me, how that creative expression can vary so much. So, when people sometimes, I think, look at the collection, they think that I must really have multiple personalities, but I don't know why I can't love for example, Pamela's work, and Katarina Grosse, for example, right? I mean, there is pure, color, to me, they're not exclusive, I mean, it's, I happen to be a developer, and we design a lot, we design a lot of buildings, and I'm just as ease with some of my crazy designers like Philippe Starck, as to something like Ralph Lauren, which is much more sort of British clubby type look. To me, it's that the execution has to be honest, and has to be well done. and that includes all forms of art, and in many ways it's a form of learning. You know, every time I look at an artist, like again, Pamela is the one that comes to mind here. I just seem to try to explore to see where they're coming from, and why the expression is done in the way that it's done. And it's a great part of my growth, not just as a collector, but as a person, to understand and appreciate this creativity that, particularly in our times, has taken so many different forms, right? I think if I was born in the 15th century or 16th century, there were just these artists that were not the same, of course, but the mediums, were so restricted, right? Now it encompasses so many different forms and so many different ways of doing things. So I feel very much at ease, and I think from 40 years, my collecting has included, figurativism and abstraction and 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 uh, and all the different forms of art.
Thank you. And I think that just to kind of wrap it up, I think that this particular exhibition, as I walk through it and soak it in, and as visitors come, given the moments we're living in, given the times that we're experiencing, I think that the exhibition does such an amazing job at addressing issues, but in such a beautiful and poetic way. So I think that, we're being bombarded by images in the media and in the press, and so I think that coming to an art space, and this is why I think we all love what we do, and we do what we do, that it's speaking of these same things in such a meaningful and different way. And so I thank an artist like Pamela and Tandazani for sharing, your thoughts and your intellect and your images with us, because I think it really is such a different way of experiencing the world that we're living in. And that's the feedback that we're getting as well, that it's taking in beauty, but also in a very thought-provoking way. So.
And Patricia, if I could add something,
Sure.
which again makes me, first of all, I want to congratulate everybody involved, because you've made me all very proud of putting together something that's really, really beautiful and meaningful. But when I do things like this, and you know me, when I do things like this, to me it was very important. Probably two things, right? One is to showcase Africa contemporary art. I really did not want just people to be thinking of Africa and thinking of a safari, or thinking of the tribal art, which is important. I wanted people to see the amazing things that are happening in Africa. The United States does not see that, so it's very important for me to showcase that. I feel very good about that. The second thing is, I sort of tried, which is impossible, but I tried to put myself as an African American, and I look at the way Americans many times look at African Americans, and their heroes and their traditions, and I wanted, and I felt that it would be a great sense of pride, being African American, to see their incredible heritage, their incredible creativity in the arts, and everything that they have brought to the table, not just in the plastic arts like we're showing, but in jazz and so forth. And to me, that was very, very important. That's why I think it's very important that all the kids, particularly from public schools where they have many children of color, whether they're Latin or African American, are going to see this and just feel this great sense of pride, of pride of their culture, pride of their history, which is very similar of why I collected Latin American art.
Sure, and I should also mention, we didn't talk about it, but we've had Masimba Wati here in residence, who's an artist from Zimbabwe, and he's been living here at El Espacio. We have a separate wing of the building that's dedicated to artist residencies, where we have apartments and living space and working space. And Masimba has been here for about 5 or 6 weeks, and he produced a piece for the exhibition, and I think that that's also incredibly important for the local community to have contact with artists from the continent as well, and bridge those gaps that are there. I mean, there is cultural affinities between so many communities in Miami with the greater notion of what is African art. So I think that we're hoping that we can achieve the goal through the residencies and through exhibitions and projects such as these. I don't know if there's any questions. I know most people are on mute, but if anybody has any question or comment, we would be happy to hear them now, or if they want to include them in the chat, or just unmute themselves momentarily.
Sorry, just while we're looking for if there are any questions, I just wanted to, I like what George was saying, and it's been reiterated by Pamela as well, about the linkages within from Africa to the rest of the diaspora. And I think just to bring in Masimba as well, one of the most obvious ways you can trace roots and migration of peoples from the continent and to the continent is through music, like jazz. Like if you want to understand Black history, just look at jazz, for example, and see how things like rumba bounce from Brazil to Congo, back to the to different parts of the US to Zimbabwe. And I love the whole concept behind Masimba's work as well, thinking about Deep City Records, the first Black record label in Miami.
Yeah, and his work has to do also with living in Detroit and Motown there, and then coming to Miami. And we've talked about the piece that we should have taken a picture of it, but we can share it. And so how beauty comes from the struggle oftentimes. So that's a conversation that we've been having quite a bit, and we're all hopeful that there's some beauty at the end of this struggle for sure. So that's it. I don't know if there's any questions. I don't think anybody included any questions in the chat. Let me just triple check. But we hope that we can see everybody soon in person. And in the meantime, we welcome to you all to please visit the Espacio 23. We'd love to have you here. Any final comments, Pamela, George?
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. George, you're good?
Thank you all. Pamela, keep the good work. I believe you're destined to be one of the greatest artists ever. So
Wow.
Stay with it.
Big shoes to fill. Thank you, Tandazani.
Thank you.
See ya.
Stay safe, everyone.
Likewise.
Bye.